All right, we are live. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We really appreciate you joining us for this, the third in our series of fall fireside chats. We've gone through two already. We've had a lot of fun. And we're here today to talk about understanding developer audience personas. We are ContentLab. For those of us who don't know us, we are a technical content marketing agency. We make technical content. That's what we do. That's all we do. We do it pretty well. We love to talk about it. We love to do it. So if you have any questions for us at any point, either get a hold of us or feel free to, if you have questions about this talk, drop them in the chat and we'll talk about them afterwards. My name is Peter White. I am a technical strategist here at content strategist here at ContentLab. My background is in full stack development. I did that for well over a decade before kind of shaking it off and moving into content to try to help other developers have a good time. Joining me today, as always, is Roger Winter. Roger, tell the people about yourself.
Hey, thanks, Peter, and thanks for joining today, everyone. I'm Roger Winter. I've been a content strategist at ContentLab for about 2 years, or a little over 2 years. Before that, I was a web developer for a decade. I've been involved in all sorts of content production efforts as well. I was doing freelance writing and search engine optimization and content strategy on my own as a freelancer. So I've been around the space a long time and excited to share some of what I learned about audience personas with you all today.
Great. Having a good hair day today, too, Roger. I appreciate it. You're looking sharp. A little bit jealous.
Thank you.
So, as I mentioned, today we are talking about understanding developer audience personas, which to me I think is vital for content creation. If you don't understand who you're talking to and have a good idea of who you're talking to, then your content's going to struggle. So, understanding your audience personas is super vital for having a successful content strategy. And so I'm going to throw to Roger here to give us kind of a little bit of background about the world of developer personas or audience personas in general.
Yeah. So audience personas weren't anything I encountered as a software developer or anything like that. But it was something that came up pretty quickly when I got into the content marketing space and learning a bit more about how to engage with people and create content strategies. But what was really interesting for me is as a software developer and at being a member of the ContentLab team, where we focus a lot on technical content specifically for software developers, it was really intriguing for me to find out that the concept of audience personas actually it had its origins in software development originally. So it wasn't a marketing concept. It was originally something developed by a software developer to help him understand his users a little bit better. Specifically, it was around 1983. There was a somewhat famous pioneering software developer, a guy by the name of Alan Cooper. And what he wanted to do was understand how a specific user would use his software. So rather than worrying about a big segment of the population or like a vague concept of who the user might be, Alan was trying to figure out who the archetypal user of his software was and what they actually did when they engaged with his software. And this is a really interesting perspective because if we zoom in on one specific audience persona, we can better understand their motivations and their needs and why they're actually engaging with it. It lets us look more about lets us look less at the sort of analytical data of how they used our product or our content, how they engaged with something, and we can start answering more of the question about why they're engaging with something. So for our efforts as content marketers, this is a really vital question because we need to understand what motivates people to engage with our content, and then we can create a direct line to capturing their interest and attention. So that's like pretty much the main goal, I would say, of most audience personas, whether we're talking about technical ones or non-technical personas, is just to understand their motivations and get like a sort of biographical fact sheet of who are these people that we're talking to and why do we want to talk to them in the first place. But another thing that I think is really important that I want to call out is personas shouldn't just be these really abstract things. A really big thing that an audience persona does is it humanizes our audience. So instead of being a disparate set of data points and some abstract concept about what we want them to do and who they are, an audience persona should be as accurate as possible and as close to representing a real person as it can. So we usually start by giving them a name, and a picture helps too, put a face on them right away. Start asking questions like, what do these personas really look like? Ask the basic biographical questions of how old are they? Where are they from? What is their job title? Then we can get more specific. We work with a lot of technical content. So our profiles focus on details like what technologies do they use, what programming languages do they know, all this kind of stuff. In the case of Alan Cooper developing his first audience persona back in the 80s, he actually chose to focus on a real person, a woman who worked at an advertising company in Silicon Valley as a product manager. And he just sat down with Kathy and he picked her brain for a long time and just constructed an audience persona based on her replies and who she actually was as a person. And I think that's an important thread, and something that I'll keep bringing back to here is just sort of the human element of creating these personas and making sure they really speak to actual individuals and not just abstract concepts.
Nice. That's yeah, a lot of background information. You didn't cover, I don't know if this is important, but it's come up every time I've seen someone define an audience persona. Do you have to give them a cheesy name? Because that's all I've ever seen, like DevOps Danny or something.
Yeah, it does. It does seem to be. They like alliteration and cheesy names. I'm not sure if it's a requirement, but it's a bonus points for sure.
For sure. I think, yeah, what Roger's talking about is really key. And I think it's getting more and more both important and challenging as we go along to properly define your developer persona, because, you know, the role of software developer has just changed so much and is becoming so kind of fragmented and niche. And it's hard to nail down exactly who your target audience would be. It's you know, a bit of, it seems like it should be fairly trivial, but it's anything but. It's hard to figure out exactly who uses your software, but it's key, because if you don't know exactly who it is that you're talking to, then realistically you're not talking to anybody, because, you know, the role of content marketing is to speak directly to a defined audience. I mean, if you're doing this just for the heck of it, then you're not really doing content marketing. You're doing art, which is harder and more complex, and you don't make any money off of it. Because the audience really is the king when it comes to marketing. I mean, you know, if you don't, like I said, if you don't know who you're talking to, you're not talking to anybody. And beyond just, you know, defining them, you have to understand who you're talking to. But you also have to, you know, like Roger said, we're humanizing these people. You have to understand the person behind the persona, because if you don't, you know, speak the same language as them, if you don't really understand their world, then it's really hard to get anything that's going to connect to them. So, you know, you not only have to spend the time trying to define your audience persona, you also have to take the time to understand who that person is and what they do and what they like and what reaches out to them, because you're writing for this person. It's you're trying to spoon feed them your information, and if you don't know who they are and you don't know how they live, then you just can't do that. So to get a little more deep into that, that's not the right phrasing, but you know what I mean. We're getting deeper into what we're talking about. We're going to be talking a little bit about the foundations of effective developer personas. So kind of what you need to build on to make sure that your persona is not just accurate, but it's also effective. And Roger will give us a little background on that.
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is technical audiences, and just to back up a little bit. So there's a couple of different ways to use audience personas, and in the context of this conversation we're having today, we're focusing pretty much on content marketing, and content marketing for technical audiences specifically, since that's what we do at ContentLab. So I just want to throw that out there, though, as I talk about some of this stuff. You might hear context around technical audiences and software, but just keep in mind this is a broader concept. You can apply audience personas, all sorts of things, but that's what we do in our day-to-day. So you're going to hear me talking about that a lot. And the one of the big things with technical audiences is they're a pretty difficult group to put labels on. There's a lot of different disparate roles and motivations and things going on, even within like specific teams on a working on a product. Like they can be using a bunch of different technologies, and they have very different reasons for using them, and all of those things relate in some way. But you need to tease all of that apart to figure out who exactly we're talking to, why we're talking to them, and what we want to say to them. And that's where audience personas really come into play. So to create an effective audience persona for a technical audience, we need to understand the technologies to begin with that they're using, but we also need to understand sort of the scope of the industry itself. So we need to understand the roles and responsibilities at different companies, how they're assigned, how tasks are distributed, what a particular persona's day-to-day workload might look like, what are they actually doing, what tools are they using, what challenges do they face, And in our case, what drives them to actually engage with content? Like what gets them to stop whatever they're doing and say, hey, I have an issue, I need some kind of help, I need some kind of outside knowledge, and then go to a search engine and look for that. So that's what we're always thinking about when we create these personas, is how do we get them to engage with content, and what facts do we need to put in the right place. But so far we've just talked about user personas broadly, but there's a bunch of different categories within user personas as well. And typically we look at three when we're going to create typically when we're going to create a plan which contains audience personas, we're going to look at a couple of different perspectives. And the main one that we've already talked about a little bit is the user persona. This was Kathy earlier, the user who actually, the persona based on an archetypal user of the software. This is someone who's actually going to engage with it. This is your end user. The second persona that's super relevant in technical content especially is the buyer persona. So these are stakeholders at an organization who are responsible for making purchase decisions and evaluating the quality of the products that they're using in the software. But they may not necessarily be an end user of the product, but they are responsible for making these decisions. So think whoever, maybe a CTO or whoever is holding the purse strings and deciding what the software that Kathy is going to be using over the next year is. That's our buyer persona. It's very important to speak to those two in distinct ways. We'll get into a little bit more of that in a second. But lastly, we construct what we call a negative persona as well. So this helps us find out who we don't want to target. And a negative persona isn't like the complete opposite of our buyer persona or our user persona. It's more of it's someone who actually might be interested in what we're saying, but they're not our target audience. And understanding who they are helps us zero in on the actual target audience a little bit better. So as an example, Kathy might have a coworker who relies on Kathy using the software, but doesn't use it themselves, and they don't make any purchasing decisions. So like while the software we're talking about might be important to them, they're not really our audience. And in the same way that we construct a persona to understand the needs and motivations of our user and our buyer, we do the same with our negative persona, just to refine who we're talking to a little bit more specifically. So yeah, those are broadly the three categories that you see in most audience personas: the user, the buyer, and the negative. And toss it over to Peter a little bit more if you want to dive into those three and give us your perspective on them.
Sure. Yeah, I will start with the user because that's what I was for a long time, yourself as well. So, I mean, that's the one I know best because I know what I was looking for when I was looking for this kind of content. And I think for technical content, the thing to keep in mind is that the user is almost always looking for an answer to a problem. Very rarely is the user just kind of browsing and is going to stumble upon an article about your software and read it and be interested. I mean, it normally comes as they've got an issue and they're looking for a solution, and hopefully they've stumbled upon your content as kind of the solution to that. And the way that they want it is I think we all have a sense for this, is not very salesy. The user is not. I think it's important. I don't want to overstate it, but I remember when I was the user and I was searching for something like this, it was usually pure panic as I'm trying to solve something time sensitive. And if you open with like a sales pitch, I'm out already because I need an answer very quickly. So the user is looking to solve a problem very quickly. So they don't need like a big flowery white paper or something. They want an article that the title is how to solve your problem, and here is how it's done. And that can be with the product or without the product, but the point is it needs to get to the answer of that right away. So things like short technical guides or even longer technical guides or documentation, all this kind of stuff that shows how the product works, that's kind of what the user is looking for. Is there anything I'm missing there, Roger, user wise, that you can think of?
No, I think that's pretty I think you got to the heart of it there, which is if you're using this, especially as a technical especially for technical content, you're usually trying to solve a problem. And what is interesting is you were saying that, just to kind of add on to what you said, I know there's a lot of situations where, say, if I'm using, let's say, a particular piece of software from a company and I go to their website looking for a solution and I land on their blog and it starts marketing to me, like you said, I'm going to close it and I'm going to go and I'm going to type the same question. I'm going to put Reddit on the end of it and I'm going to read a Reddit thread, which has the solution and it doesn't have any nonsense to it, which is interesting because like for that company that lost my traffic, that they just lost an opportunity to engage with me in another way. But all they had to do was solve my problem at the start. You could even put some of that marketing in the bottom, but you just need to address the user's problem quickly. And then if they had my attention and they solved my problem, I may have actually read their ad. So it's just something to keep in mind of how you position these things.
That's a good point. Yeah, to me as a user, the best article to get me to use your software is one that tells me how to solve my problem without your software first, and then goes, you want to do that even faster and easier? Here's how you can do it with the product. And I would go, okay, yeah, I don't really want to do the hard way. I'll take the easy way.
Absolutely.
So that's the user. The buyer, no one's ever let me be a buyer, but I've talked to lots of buyers and tried to convince them to buy things. So I've got somewhat of a sense of them. The buyer for technical products is typically someone with a technical background who's either succeeded to the point that now they don't be hands-on anymore or something to that effect. It's usually someone with a technical background, but who is more concerned at the moment with the business implications of the product. So they don't necessarily need to see a hands-on guide, but there does have to be enough technical information there to prove to them that the product is worthy. And they need to see kind of the bigger picture. So beyond just solving a problem, they need to know how this product is going to help kind of the team as a whole and the business side of it. So they need a product that can scale across a whole company, that can grow with the company, that can kind of work at that scale for their clients and will still be usable in the future. So they're kind of looking at it from a much bigger picture, and to reach them, your content has to kind of straddle that line between business value and technical merit. You have to prove yourself on both sides, but without getting into the weeds as much as you do with users. So things like white papers that really kind of tie the technical side and the business side together are big. Case studies are huge. Buyers like to see other buyers who have had success with the product and hear their words as opposed to yours. So things like that to really kind of to prove both the technical acumen and the business value of it are key. I think I used acumen right there, Roger. I might have just thrown that in wrong, but it feels right.
It felt right to me as well. Yeah, just to add to what you said there a little bit, I think the buyer stage is I wouldn't say more data driven necessarily, but they definitely like to see a lot of data to inform the buyer persona. Is usually looking for things like return on investment or like total cost of ownership or adoption or like some kind of metrics of past success that other companies have had, all those kind of things, which as we just said, like the some of that might be interesting in certain user facing content. Like a user might be slightly interested in how successful this solution was, but that's like something that should be buried in there as an off point, right? But that's something you want to put at the forefront of the buyer persona. So just like understanding that these personas usually do have overlapping interests and motivations, but dialing in really what are the differentiators between them is one of the more powerful capabilities of audience personas, in my opinion.
That's a good point. And the only one left here is negative, which Roger touched on a bit before. As Roger mentioned, it's not the exact opposite of who you're trying to reach. Like if your target persona is JavaScript developers, the negative persona isn't a mime or something. It's not something crazy off. It's more subtle than that. So like something, for instance, like if your product is aimed at small businesses or something, and you know that it doesn't have the scale to handle an enterprise company, you want to make sure that your target audience is small or medium business developers and not a developer at Meta or something huge. You want to find the subtle ways to figure out exactly who you're talking to and know who you're not trying to hit, so that while you're creating your content, you can keep that in mind that, okay, I want to make sure that this appeals to the smaller market, so I'm going to write in a style that makes that kind of obvious, or touch on that at the start, so that I can kind of repel those negative personas and not kind of waste all of our time by having them go through it and contact me. So it's a little more subtle and a little more there's a little more nuance to it, but it's really key for getting kind of that last jump to really define your audience.
Yeah, I think it comes out really strongly in technical content a lot as well. And I would say like the negative persona in some cases doesn't need to be as well defined or as well mapped out as the other two personas, but it's good to just have as a reference. And um, there's a lot of examples. I'm sure you could come up with some of these as well, Peter. But like for me, something that I've noticed pretty frequently is uh, like around like data topics, especially like the difference between a data scientist and a data engineer is actually massive, but on the face you might not really recognize that. And similarly, like there's a lot of people who have the role of DevOps, and but what does that mean?
Mm.
DevOps means 1,000 different things. So being able to tease out these, like if we have a product that's very specifically targeting data scientists, we don't want the data engineers, but there is a lot of overlap there. So like data engineers might be interested in our content and they might read it, but we don't, that's not who we're trying to get to. So like, yeah, just like these really nuanced things. And examples like that, I think, are where negative personas really shine, and can actually provide a lot of content, a lot of value to your other content.
Yeah, for me, the positive personas, for lack of a better term, are the kind of, to me, that feels like, that's how you rough out 80% of your audience persona, and then the negative persona is the last little bit where you're kind of refining it to me.
Yeah.
So now that we've talked about what makes a good persona, how do we go about creating them, Roger? How do we sit down with our product and our team and decide what the right persona is?
So there's certainly processes and procedures you can go through, but I feel like it's pretty different for almost every persona, because most personas require you to reach into slightly different areas, in the sense that we are trying to get, right to the core of what this audience is interested in. So the original persona that we referenced previously, that was developed in the 80s with Kathy, the way that was developed is Cooper simply sat down with her and asked her a whole bunch of questions, and over the course of various conversations, he constructed uh, basically a model of what she would think, and use that to imagine her actions as a user of the software. Um, so honestly, this is probably one of the most effective ways of building a persona, is just engaging with the actual audience. But of course, like, we rarely have the luxury of doing this in the one-on-one way that they were that this example did it. Uh, but fortunately, we do have huge amounts of information available to us on the internet. We have all sorts of ways of collecting information. So that's usually where I start in my research for audience personas. Um, I also seem to be developing a Canadian accent every time I say audience personas, but I
I
don't
wasn't going to
really.
bring it up, but there is a little bit of stank on audience there. I like it.
Yeah, and I think that's your fault. But in any case, um, so where do we usually start? There's huge amounts of information on forum posts and social media. That's a good place to understand audience, like what are their challenges and what are they actually talking about? What are their motivations? Because they'll tell you. I mean, it's not always easy to find, but especially now we have tools like sentiment analysis and all kinds of things you can do to just pull information out of these repositories online. So that's good for understanding some of the more um, less hard facts, I suppose, where you want to understand the more abstract things about what are they actually engaging with and what kind of questions are they asking. And then in terms of creating the sort of biographical side of the audience persona, um, there's things like Google Analytics and all sorts of other services that collect data about web traffic. Or if you run a software, if you have a piece of software, you probably have some kind of similar analytics platform, or signups to your website, or whatever it is, using all of that internal data that you're probably already collecting. And that can give you insights into, the demographics, the geography, the age, all this kind of information to flesh out the the hard details of your audience persona. Um, so yeah, that's where I usually start. And depending on how much resources you have and what the scale that you're working at is, another really cool thing is the internet now lets us engage with users in mass. So instead of spending the afternoon interviewing Kathy, you could construct a survey that asks similar questions, send that out to 5,000 users, and collect the data back from that. Or um, so that's usually how it starts. It starts with data collection, and then typically putting that into some kind of a template. So we want to answer the basic questions. What is this person's silly persona name that we're going to give them? What is their job title? how old are they, and just kind of collecting all this information in the template, remembering that as you collect this information, we're looking for the averages or the means of this data. So we're not targeting it. Ideally, we want to find the user who is right dead center in the middle of our population of users, who is the absolute average, and speak to them, because like we want to humanize this, but we also want to make the appeal as broad as possible across the audience. So I think it's important to focus on a specific person, but remembering that that's the archetypal person, and then feeding that into your audience persona to just kind of construct an average and say, this is roughly who we're speaking to. And then anyone who's outside of those bounds should still be close enough to what we constructed that whatever we're sending out still resonates.
That's a good point. And I think one way to do that sometimes companies maybe overlook is that it's okay to use multiple personas. It's okay. You don't have to have a single defined persona for everybody that's going to be using your product. If DevOps engineers are going to use it for one thing and developers are using it for another thing, you can have two different personas. You just have to make sure you speak to both of them. And you can almost use one as the negative persona of the other, so that you write pieces that hit that one smaller target group. If you're trying to, if you have a big product and you have only one persona, the odds are not good that you're accurately speaking to anybody. You're kind of being a little too broad, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and just to add to that really quickly, so we have obviously the broad segments of buyer, user, and negative that we already talked about, but especially as you get into developing multiple personas and having more, or even within the same persona, you may have segments. Typical segments are things like location, so geographical, behavioral, psychographic, these sorts of segments within your audience. So we understand maybe we have an audience persona for DevOps engineers, but within that, within DevOps Danny or whatever we're going to call him, there's DevOps Danny in California, and there's DevOps Danny in Toronto, and there's DevOps Danny in Austin, and they have different motivations, and they may have different behaviors and things like that. So we can start to refine and really dial in who we're talking to, building off of that average. From we have the average, now we can sort of get a little more specific.
For sure. And I think it's key to know too that this kind of an ever evolving process. I mean, your personas may change over time, and it's kind of key to keep monitoring them to see changes both within your product and in the industry, to kind of see how you need to update these personas to stay relevant, because they can get old DevOps Dan can become dusty old Dan if you leave them alone for too long. So
yeah, and that's probably one of our biggest challenges in doing this for technical content, because if you've been around the tech industry for a while, roles are constantly shifting, and you might have the same job title one year to the next, but be doing something completely different and using different technologies. And so yeah, it's important not to think of these as static portraits. We need to keep these things alive and evolving as people do.
And the other thing that I do want to, before we move on to the next topic, is that developing a really effective persona, you do kind of have to listen to feedback and garner feedback and gather the way people think of your product outside of your organization, because oftentimes the way the organization thinks that a product is going to be used or will be used, or who the people who are using it can be a little bit off. So without that outside input to really understand how people in the field are using your product, it can be a little bit skewed if you just kind of go by who built it, because those of us building things don't always know who the end user is properly, because we sit in a dark room for months on end writing code.
Absolutely.
So we've got one more little segment that we want to talk about here. I said this off the top, but I'm going to say it again. If you have any questions for us about this topic, we're going to have a little Q&A at the end. So feel free to drop anything in the chat. We'd love to talk about anything that you guys want to talk about on this topic as well. So the last thing that I think is really key about this topic is how to use these personas to grow your audience. Like it's fine to have a little defined audience with your perfect little personas, but every company obviously wants to grow and wants to get a larger audience. So how do we go about doing that, Roger?
Yeah, there's a couple of different threads we could jump into there. So, I mean, clearly just knowing who you're speaking to is important. And as we said, it evolves over time. So when you're when you start off and maybe you have a very specific audience segment and you're looking to target, a couple hundred people or something. But then as you grow and you have this massive audience, or hopefully you have more eyeballs coming to you, uh, it becomes important to understand some of the opportunities in there. So you might end up even developing different audience personas just based on who is coming over to you, and understanding your audience as it expands, because it's likely to unlock new segments and people who may not have been represented by your original personas. And this kind of goes back into what we were just talking about of how to actually even begin constructing these personas, and importantly that's an ongoing process. It's not something you should just start once and then stop. So once you sort of have those wheels turning, it's really important to keep them turning, and create this feedback loop where, whether your audience is growing or even if it's shrinking or whatever is happening, it's important to be aware of that, and how that's changing your audience. So continuously engaging with them is really important. Setting up ways to get community feedback and user feedback. And obviously this feedback is not going to be about your audience personas, but it's going to be about what is actually going on in the communities that are using your products. And you can use that information to feed into and refine your personas a little bit better. Competitor market industry research, all of these things are incredibly important. Understanding who are your competitors speaking to, which is another interesting point, especially as your audience expands. If you find yourself having competitors who seem to be speaking to audience personas you haven't developed, that could be a clue that maybe you're leaving some of your audience on the table. Also, like, I think internal alignment is really interesting as you grow your audience. There may be opportunities to sort of bring in different teams at your organization and use content to solve problems to the target audience personas you may not have even thought about. So if you're mostly focusing on creating user-based content, focused on the user profile, maybe your sales team has a bunch of objections that keep happening in the sales process, and that's an opportunity to create a buyer persona and really figure out what the troubles they're having is. So all of these things just mostly, I think it's just a matter of just keeping this process alive continuously and not being afraid to go back and shift your audience personas, which can be a challenge, especially if you find something that's really effective and you just want to stick with it because it worked really well in the past. So don't be afraid to, update, change, add new personas, and kind of just don't be afraid to go back to step one. It would be my main advice. As your audience expands, expand with them, and don't be too attached to whatever got you there in the first place.
That's right. Throw those personas right in the garbage when you need to. I think one thing that we really haven't touched on at all, but one thing that I think is really good for growing your audience is understanding that not everybody who's in your target persona takes in content the same way. So, I mean, if you're, regardless of who your target market is, whoever your DevOps stand is, some of them we are going to want to read content, but there's people who prefer taking in via video. There's people who, for whatever reason, either don't like reading or have struggled with reading. And so kind of adapting the format of your content, it gives you a chance to reach a whole different audience. So experimenting with different formats, experimenting with video, experimenting with, more infographic type thing. That's the right word, right? Infographic. I think, yeah, pictures that tell a story. Make some pretty pictures and tell people what to do. Obviously, I'm not very good with words myself, but it's important to make sure that you're covering the whole market. So your whole audience persona that includes how they take in content. And the other thing that I think is really key, and I do find this sometimes, we work with a lot of marketing departments for products and stuff, is that if the people doing the content marketing don't fully understand the product, you're going to be missing some potential audience. So fully understanding what your product does and how it can be used allows you to kind of identify maybe personas that aren't necessarily your main persona, but people who could be using your software that don't know about it or don't know that they could be using it. So understanding all the ways in which your product can be used allows you to kind of create additional personas and write content to them and be able to draw in some people who maybe aren't reached by your target single audience persona.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to wrap it up. So if you've got another point there, feel free to throw it in quick.
No, I think we can wrap it up there. Just Yeah, just pretty much going to agree with you, and just invite people to just like I said before, just continuously revisit these things and not be afraid to make changes, and just experiment.
All right, so we're gonna do a little Q&A now. So any questions that you have, get them in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can here for the next 10 or 15 minutes. Our first question, Roger, from the audience. When you form your buyer personas, do you consider the buying group or an individual within the buying group? It's a good question.
Yeah, so it's kind of a weird blend of both, but I would say that the persona itself focuses on the individual within the buying group. Always, that's why we give them a name and humanize them, and we give them a fictional age and all of this kind of information. But like we were saying earlier, that hopefully that single individual represents the average of all of the other people within that audience segment. So so I guess the answer there is sort of don't get too specific, but target the individual, if that makes sense. It is kind of a balancing act, because if we just start thinking about the group and the buying group in general, I feel like it quickly becomes abstract, and we could sit around and argue about what these hypothetical people would or would not do. And that's actually very useful in the context of this sort of thought experiment of an audience persona. But it becomes much more difficult for arguing about what a group of people would do versus a single person. We can sort of define a single person's motivations and goals and use those to kind of extrapolate. So as long as if we're effective at picking the person who is truly in the center of our distribution of our audience, then we'll create a persona that speaks to the buyer group just through being an effective persona.
Yeah, I would add to that I think when you're actually creating content and creating your messaging and getting down to the bare bones of writing or recording or whatever it is you're doing, it's much easier to think of speaking to a single person than it is to a group. It's like Roger said, you can kind of define how that one person feels, and you can kind of play on that and try to make that kind of real connection, like that real one-on-one connection. It's hard to connect to a group the same way it is to a person. So I find, maybe this is just me personally, but when I'm writing content, I find if I'm thinking about that one person, it makes it a lot easier to kind of write something that's focused and will create that strong connection, as opposed to throwing it to a group and hoping that a certain percentage of them are going to latch onto you. Hopefully that's answered it in some way. Number 2, Roger, how often should audience personas be reevaluated and updated to ensure they stay relevant and effective?
Yeah, there's not a simple answer to that, but I mean, I guess the sort of rubric for that would be, well, I guess it's something you probably want to do regularly. Just it's a good idea to maybe have a refresh at a certain interval, whether that's every quarter, every 6 months, or every year. And things might not change too much when you do them, but it's good to just keep the process alive. But more than that, I would say if there's any like really big changes on the horizon, anything you've noticed on an industry level or within your company, I'd say that's usually a really good time to go and revisit audience personas and anything else that informs your marketing. Other than that, like if there's major changes and on a regular cycle, and otherwise, maybe just kind of considering it as a sort of a continuous process. So if you gain some insights through some other research that feed into that might feed well into your audience persona, just take those opportunities as they arise.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's no, like I said, there's no easy way, no easy answer. There's no number. There's no you can't say every 7 weeks or something. But I think, like you said, anytime something changes either in your industry or in your company, like with your product, then it's important to reevaluate and make sure that your personas are still accurate. And a lot of the time they will be. A lot of the time there's not a big change you're gonna have to make. But if you release new features or you change your target focus for your product, you need to reevaluate your personas and make sure you're speaking to the right people. So like Roger said, it's a continuous thing. It's just something it's like cleaning your house. You're just kind of always doing it. You're always picking away and always trying to get it just right. And it never quite is. Sorry, I just bought a house. It's always dirty. All right, number 3, Roger. How can you tell that you've got the right audience persona for your product?
Ooh, that's the $1 million question. Well, in our field of content, we tend to know if we've got the right persona, if we're getting a lot of traffic, and if that traffic is actually doing what our goal is. So in our previous fireside chats, we've talked a lot about the marketing funnel, and the main thing with the marketing funnel is that you have content that eventually ideally produces some kind of a goal. So that's usually something like a conversion or a sign up or something like that. So that is like some of the hard data I think you could look at for understanding if your audience personas are effective. If you're not getting a lot of traffic, if no one is, or if there's like some like strong opposition to something you wrote, like I don't know, if you're getting a bunch of comments of like people disagreeing or something, that's a pretty good sign that you're not targeting the right persona. You may even be saying the right things to the wrong people in a case like that. So just being very cognizant of data, like analytics around performance, I would say is probably the main way to do it. And that's kind of abstract because it's not like a one-to-one, like, oh, I made a bad persona, so this isn't getting traffic, but it's an indicator that things aren't working. What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the best way is if you can get to the point that you've formed a bit of a community and you get constant feedback on what you're doing. That, I mean, is the most direct way, but that's obviously difficult. Like you said, metrics are a big thing, obviously, but also, the kind of response that you're getting. So if you are getting, some sort of sales interest from your content, but it keeps being a little bit off, like you're getting not quite the right buyer persona or not quite the right company, maybe they don't have the perfect understanding of your product, then either you're targeting the wrong people or your messaging is a bit off. So it's again, there's no easy answer. If it was super easy to know if you had the right persona, then we wouldn't be having these fireside chats. Everybody would just have it figured out. But it's a long game and it's a continuous game, and it's more just keeping a pulse on the response, like you said, both in metrics and in actually talking to people and getting feedback. So again, there's a lot of these questions don't have a straightforward answer, and a lot of them are just a continuous process that are a little bit different for everybody. So just keep your eyes open and listen is the best you can do.
I think you touched on something important there, though, which is especially if you're in a situation where you're like collecting leads and sales and stuff like that information. Look at who comes to you and try to match that up with your audience persona. If all the people who are answering your forms look nothing like what your audience persona is, it's probably time to revisit it, or refine it. If it's pretty close, but you find there's like the 10% that's different, that's a really great tool to get that 10%.
Yeah, you need to work with your team and get those kind of metrics back. All right, this is a really kind of timely question, so let's try this. How can I ensure my content is created to my ICP, my ideal customer profile, and how can I utilize or not utilize AI tools for this? That's kind of a little two-parter.
Oh, yeah. What do you think, Peter? Where would you start with that?
I mean, I find in the current state of AI, it's not been great at writing for a particular audience. I mean, it helps to define your audience to them, but I find that AI tools, they're not, if your content isn't right for your ICP, AI tools aren't going to fix it and make it right. I mean, you can't really at this moment use AI to help define your ICP, and you can't give it a piece of content and go, is this going to be good for JavaScript developers? Like, it'll give you an answer, but I wouldn't trust it. So I think that kind of work really needs to be a human judgment and not an AI. I think you need to have people on your team who understand the product and who understand the audience. You need to do that research, and unfortunately, I don't think there's an AI shortcut around that at the moment.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would be very cautious about using AI to try to hone in on to create content for certain personas or anything like that. You can certainly prompt AI like that, but as much understanding as you can give it of your audience persona, it might help it a little bit. But I'd say that's somewhere where AI kind of falls short. Like it doesn't understand the experience of being in one of these personas in the way that we can sort of project ourselves. So yeah, I'd be cautious about trying to use AI to dial in any kind of audience persona.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the best way to get AI that writes to your ICP is to give it examples of content that's already written for those people. I don't think there's a better way than that, and that involves somebody already understanding it right out of the gate. So I wish there was a content AI that would do that, but for now, we're gonna have to learn about the product and the industry, unfortunately. All right, I think we got time for one more question here, Roger. We will go through one last one here. We talked a little bit about this, about how you need to kind of understand your personas more than just being able to define them. You need to understand who they are as people. Roger, how can you learn more about your audience personas?
Yeah, so I feel like we kind of keep coming back to this in different ways because it is a really important question. But the main thing is to try to engage with them in whatever way you can, and let them tell you what they're thinking. Just going back to that original audience persona that was created out of just sitting down and interviewing someone. I think if you can apply that concept at scale, that's the most effective way to do any of this. So it's not going to be sitting down and talking to someone, or it may be, but things like surveys and just continually engaging, reading forms, getting metrics. And if you can, talk to as many people as you can. Like that could be a huge way to do this. You could go to a conference or something and decide you're going to develop an audience persona of 10 salespeople and go talk to 10 salespeople and come back and put that together. It's really about getting information from people, asking them who they are, what their needs are, and just trying to work backwards to kind of reverse engineer some content that would appeal to them.
For sure. And I mean, also, lurk in their spaces and read what they read, and like I said, talk to them if you can, but even if you can't, read how they talk to each other, and just, you got to live in the world a little bit. That's really all there is to it, until our AI friend figures out how to do it for us. All right, I think that's all we have time for questions, Roger. So we'll wrap this up here. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us anytime. Drop us an email. We love talking about this stuff. And if you're looking for any help, technical content wise, we've had a ton of experience defining audience personas. We do this every day, so we can certainly help you understand who you're talking to. So reach out to us anytime. Just as a little summary, kind of some key takeaways from today. Audience personas, the persona should be your driving force behind your content. These are the people you're trying to talk to. You want to make sure they're well defined so you can write content directly for them, use them as kind of your guidepost. In order to understand your audience, you got to kind of live in it. And it's a constant process. You just have to always keep your ear to the ground, make sure you understand your audience, your product, and your industry, and update it as it goes along. It's a constant process. And feedback is really key. The only way to know that your content is working is to go through feedback, either through metrics or through direct feedback. So listen to what people say, pay attention to what's going on, and it'll help you really define these personas and really learn how to write to them. So having said that, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here. Like I said, we love talking about this kind of stuff. So any questions, let us know. This is the third in our series of Fireside Chats. We have one more remaining. That'll be in 2 weeks, Tuesday, November 9th. At the same time, we'll be talking about balancing trends with evergreen insights. So we would love for you to join us for that. If you have any questions ahead of that talk, feel free to send them to us. Otherwise, we will see you on November 9th. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. Have a great day.